Hey everyone, it's Alexander, the real Mr. Robinson. Welcome to the channel. So it's coming, guys. We are just 1 week away. A little over a week, but regardless, we are very close to Godzilla vs. Kong. At long last, 59 years after their original fight in 1962, we'll finally get to see them fight each other again, and it's exciting. And I know some of you were wondering, what am I going to do in prep for this movie? Is there a Godzilla-related video that I'm going to do? Well, yes. And it's a Kong-related video as well, because, come on, it's a King Kong and a Godzilla movie. So when Godzilla King of the Monsters came out 2 years ago, I did very short videos every single day of the month leading up to that movie's release, where I talk about my favorite bits of the Godzilla series, and some of my least favorite bits. But now with this coming out, I figured it would be the best thing to just go over the entire history of both monsters, how they started, how they first fought, and how we got here. And originally it was just going to be a history lesson on the original King Kong versus Godzilla, and every attempt that was made to try to get these two to fight again. But the more I did research for this video, the more I thought, why don't I just cover the entire history of both monsters? There are some things I'm going to go into detail about, but then some other things that I'm just going to breeze by quickly because I don't have all day. As much as I would love to talk all day about Godzilla and King Kong, I know I have other things to do, and you probably have other things to do as well. So this is probably going to be a bunch of knowledge that you may already know if you're a fan of Godzilla and King Kong, but if you don't know some of this stuff, or you're completely new to either franchise, then hey, this is the video for you. Think of this as a refresher course if you know most of this stuff, but if there's some stuff you don't know, then I hope you learned something. We all know the original films for both monsters. King Kong came out in April of 1933 in the United States and became this juggernaut of a hit. And it was also a groundbreaking movie. Fantastic special effects, epic storytelling, a movie in the early days of sound that just uses it non-stop. It's an incredible movie and features some of the most iconic set pieces ever made. It was directed by Ernest B. Schoedsack and Marion C. Cooper and released by RKO. And it's one of my 10 favorite movies of all time. It's number 8. I absolutely love this movie. Then in 1949, Ernest B. Schoedsack directed a spiritual successor to King Kong, if you will, called Mighty Joe Young. Marion C. Cooper was the producer this time around. And it's a really good movie as well. Not one of my favorites, but still a fantastic movie if you haven't seen it. Willis O'Brien, who did the stop-motion animation for the original King Kong, did the animation work for Mighty Joe Young as well, but he also had his assistant, Ray Harryhausen, working on the movie. Then in 1953, Ray Harryhausen would get his big break on his own with The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, which, again, is one of my top 100 favorite movies of all time. At number 100, but still, it's a great movie regardless for the type of monster movie that it is. Now, it's important that I mention these two movies, Mighty Joe Young and The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, because without King Kong, there would probably be no Mighty Joe Young. Without Mighty Joe Young, there'd probably be no Ray Harryhausen. Without Ray Harryhausen, there'd probably be no Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. And without the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, there'd probably be no Godzilla. Yes, there are other things that inspired the original movie, like the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Lucky Dragon No. 5 incident that happened the same year as the release of this movie. But if there was ever one movie that is a direct inspiration for Godzilla, it would be The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. And Tomoyuki Tanaka, the producer of this movie, and basically the father of Godzilla, has acknowledged this as well. But I can see why people would say King Kong is a direct inspiration for Godzilla, because Eiji Tsuburaya was a big fan of King Kong as well. And both movies have quite a few similarities to them. They both are the debut film for the two most iconic movie monsters ever. They both feature groundbreaking special effects, King Kong with stop motion, and Godzilla with miniatures and suitmation. Both movies inspired future directors later down the line, from Steven Spielberg to John Carpenter to Peter Jackson. And both movies actually end in a very tragic manner for the monsters. It's a weird thing to say, considering that these monsters have killed people and destroyed buildings left and right, but King Kong didn't ask to be plucked from his world and put into ours. Godzilla didn't ask to be reawoken and radiated by atomic weapons. And even if you don't feel sympathy for Godzilla by the end of that movie, it still ends in a very powerful manner with Dr. Serizawa sacrificing his life in order to destroy Godzilla, but also keep the oxygen destroyer away from the wrong hands. It's a very powerful ending, and having watched both these movies back to back right before doing this video, the ending to Godzilla still is a gut punch. But unfortunately, both of these movies also led to two cash grab sequels that came out months after the original. Son of Kong came out in December of 1933, and Godzilla Raids Again came out in April of 1955. I like Godzilla Raids Again more than I do Son of Kong, but at the same time, I like Son of Kong more than Gigantus the Fire Monster. Then in 1956, a year after Godzilla Raids Again is released in Japan, the original film is exported to the United States, re-edited and reworked as Godzilla King of the Monsters, starring Raymond Burr. And for a lot of people outside of Japan, including myself, this was considered to be the original Godzilla. And while it loses a lot of the emotional weight that the original had, it's still a really good movie. And without it, Godzilla probably wouldn't have been a household name outside of Japan. So that's the origin of both monsters. How did they come together? How did they fight as the third movie in each series? Well, in the early 60s, Willis O'Brien, who did the stop-motion animation for King Kong, came up with an idea for a new Kong movie titled King Kong vs. Frankenstein. The concept was that King Kong was just going to fight a monster created by Dr. Frankenstein, where the monster was created using bits of animal pieces. So he had a difficult time getting this movie made. Other studios were just not interested in doing it. So eventually it was bought by a producing friend of his, John Beck. So what John Beck ended up doing was taking the project overseas. Toho was interested in it, took the idea, but replaced the Frankenstein monster with their own monster, Godzilla. So in 1962, on the 30th anniversary of Toho's existence, King Kong vs. Godzilla was released, and it is one of my top 10 favorite Godzilla movies of all time. I think it's very funny, very clever, and the monster fights are just entertaining as hell. Unfortunately, this movie's existence didn't really sit well with Willis O'Brien, who didn't know what John Beck did with the project until the movie was released in Japan. So Willis O'Brien tried to sue John Beck, but unfortunately he didn't have the money to go through the lawsuit, and eventually Willis O'Brien died of a heart attack in November of 1962. According to his widow, the stress of dealing with the King Kong vs. Frankenstein project was something that helped with the heart attack. So that's kind of unfortunate for Willis O'Brien, but a year later in 1963, the movie is exported to the United States and again reworked for American audiences. This was part of the deal that John Beck had with Toho, that he would handle the US distribution rights and the studio that would release the movie is Universal, which one of the reasons why I'm wearing this shirt. I don't like this version of King Kong vs. Godzilla, but I can kind of see why this movie was re-edited for American audiences. Because at its core, the Japanese version is a satire about the Japanese television industry at the time, and a very comedic satire at that. That's something that US audiences probably wouldn't understand, so I can see why they reworked it. But unfortunately, because of that, you lose all the clever comedic moments. This version's a little more serious, and the comedy that's in this movie is a lot more broad. And also, there's the unforgivable sin of removing most of Akira Ifukube's score, which, no, why would you do that? But regardless of how I feel about this version, it was a big hit in the United States, just like the original was a big hit in Japan. And that same year in Japan, Shinichi Segazawa, the film's writer, came up with an idea for a direct sequel called Continuation King Kong vs. Godzilla. And that's as far as it ever got. No sequel was ever made to that movie, at least no direct sequel. But what about the Frankenstein monster? Toho pretty much removed that monster with Godzilla. Well, Toho wanted to make a Frankenstein movie for some time, and in 1964 they wanted to make Godzilla vs. Frankenstein. But that didn't really go through, so eventually they continued the Godzilla series with Mothra vs. Godzilla and Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster that same year. And then in 1965 you had Invasion of the Astro Monster, which is the sixth Godzilla movie, and came out the same year as Toho's own Frankenstein movie, Frankenstein Conquers the World, or Frankenstein vs. Baragon. But what about King Kong? Well, Toho had the rights to make one more Kong movie, and they decided to collaborate with Rankin Bass, who made those Christmas specials like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Frosty the Snowman, and Santa Claus is Coming to Town, but they were also producing a King Kong animated show back then. And the original concept for this collaboration was a movie called Operation Robinson Crusoe, King Kong vs. Ebirah. But unfortunately, Rankin Bass dropped out of the project because they wanted Ishiro Honda to direct the movie, whereas Toho wanted Jun Fukuda to direct the movie. So the project fell through, but rather than scrapping it altogether, they decided to replace King Kong with Godzilla, and thus you have the 7th Godzilla movie, Ebirah Horror of the Deep, or Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, which I think is a much more boring title. And when you watch that movie with the knowledge that Godzilla's role was supposed to be Kong's, it makes sense, because Godzilla has an affection for Kumi Mizuno's character, something that Kong would do, not Godzilla. Godzilla fights Mothra at the end of the movie, despite the fact that these two have teamed up to save the Earth from Ghidorah. But if King Kong was still in that role, him fighting Mothra would make sense because the two monsters have never fought each other, and almost had the opportunity to fight each other, or at least coexist in the same movie, but that didn't happen. So eventually, Rankin Bass and Toho came together again and made that collaborated King Kong movie, this time called King Kong Escapes from 1967. It's corny, it's cheesy, but I think it's a lot of fun. Honestly, I like it better than Son of Kong and the Dino De Laurentiis movies. And 1967 was actually a very big year for Japanese giant monster movies, because outside of King Kong Escapes, you had Gappa the Triphibian Monster released by Nakatsu, you had The X from Outer Space released by Shochiku, which I reviewed last year, Daiei released the 3rd Gamera movie, Gamera vs. Gaios, and Toho themselves released the 8th Godzilla movie, Son of Godzilla. So it was a pretty bonkers year for giant monster movies in Japan. So the next year, in 1968, Toho released the 9th Godzilla movie, Destroy All Monsters, with the intention of this being the last one. But because it made a lot of money, the Showa-era Godzilla movies continued up until 1975 with Terror of Mechagodzilla. It's interesting to note that Ishiro Honda, who directed the first Godzilla movie, directed Terror of Mechagodzilla, which not only was the last Showa Godzilla movie, but was Honda's last movie before retiring, and eventually going on to help Kurosawa with his final films. Back in the United States in 1976, Dino De Laurentiis and Paramount Pictures remade King Kong, and remake's actually a strong word, it's just more of a reimagining because it takes place in a completely different time period, the characters are different, there's no fantasy element to it, the special effects are done through suitmation and miniatures rather than stop motion, and it's not a very good movie. It's not terrible, and when I rewatched this movie 4 years ago, it actually wasn't as bad as I remember it, and the best part about the movie, well, there are two things. One is the special effects. The second thing is something I'll get to a little later, but all in all, it's just not that good of a movie. Then 8 years later, in 1984, back in Japan, Toho decided to revive the Godzilla series and make a direct sequel to the original Godzilla called The Return of Godzilla. This kicked off the second Godzilla series, also known as the Heisei Godzilla series, even though this particular movie was made during the Showa era of Japan. A year later, in 1985, The Return of Godzilla would be exported to the United States and reworked for its American release called Godzilla 1985. A pretty lazy title, and it makes me wonder if that was the influence for Wonder Woman 1984's title, but whatever. This movie's not that good. It's vastly inferior to the Japanese version, although I can't say it's a complete disaster because Raymond Burr is at least good in the movie and the only thing keeping these new American scenes afloat. And the movie actually has some tighter editing. Shots are trimmed down a bit so it doesn't feel as long, but at the end of the day, you're just better off watching the Japanese version. Then the next year, in 1986, Dino De Laurentiis would produce a sequel to his remake of King Kong called King Kong Lives, and it is the single worst King Kong movie ever made. It's corny, it's laughably stupid, but not for the same enjoyable reasons that King Kong Escapes is stupid. It was just a sequel that came in 10 years too late, and Yeah, it's just not good at all. But that wasn't the only King Kong related thing to happen in 1986. I mentioned there were two good things that came out of the 1976 movie, and the second one is the King Kong encounter, which opened up at Universal Studios Hollywood. It was part of the tram tour, and it was an amazing section of the tram, and I really wish that ride was still around. I'll get back to that little detail down the line, but basically this ride was not only great, but it changed the game for Universal when it came to theme parks, because in 1990 that marked the opening of Universal Studios Florida and Kongfrontation, which was an opening day attraction. Basically, it's a longer version of the King Kong encounter. I haven't been on it myself because the first time I ever visited Universal Orlando was 4 years after the ride closed. So I wish I had the opportunity to ride this ride, but what can you do? Well, a year before Kongfrontation opened, the second Godzilla movie in the Heisei series was released, Godzilla vs. Biollante, which is a really good movie, but it didn't do so well at the box office. So what Toho wanted to do as a result of Godzilla vs. Biollante not doing very well is that they wanted to have Godzilla and King Kong fight each other again. In 1990, the same year that Universal Studios Florida and Kongfrontation opened, Toho wanted to remake King Kong vs. Godzilla, but title it Godzilla vs. King Kong. But unfortunately, Ted Turner, who had the rights to King Kong at the time, asked for a lot of money, more money than Toho was willing to spend, so they scrapped the project, and then a year later, in 1991, we got Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. In 1992, Toho tried to do this again, but instead of actually using King Kong, they decided to use Mechani-Kong and create Godzilla vs. Mechani-Kong. It's a pretty cool concept where a team of humans were going to be shrunk and sent into Godzilla's body, Fantastic Voyage style, and fight him from within while Mechani-Kong fought Godzilla on the outside. But it didn't make a whole lot of sense for a mechanical version of a monster that doesn't exist in this series to fight Godzilla. So eventually this movie got canned as well, because according to Ted Turner, even using Kong's likeliness would require Toho to pay a fee. So again, the movie got scrapped and was replaced by Godzilla vs. Mothra. So eventually the Heisei Godzilla series ran its course, with 1993's Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, 1994's Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, and ending with 1995's Godzilla vs. Destoroyah, which was intended to be the last Godzilla movie, if not forever, then at least 10 years. That all changed in 1998 when Roland Emmerich released his remake of Godzilla, which is terrible. It's not even a Godzilla movie at all. And the only people who hated this movie more than audiences and critics were Toho themselves, because this prompted them to bring back the Godzilla series as quickly as possible. And thus we have the Millennium series of Godzilla movies that ran from 1999 with Godzilla 2000 up until 2004 with Godzilla Final Wars. And in that movie, the real Godzilla fights the fake Godzilla and kills him in less than a minute. I think even less than 30 seconds. Like, it was the big final screw you from Toho to Roland Emmerich. But also in 2004, the original unaltered Japanese version of Godzilla was released for the first time outside of Japan, and it changed the conversation about how to view Godzilla now, and Again, I love this movie. But what about King Kong? What's going on with him during this time period? Well, in 2002, the same year Godzilla against Mechagodzilla was released, Kongfrontation at Universal Studios Florida closes and is eventually replaced by Revenge of the Mummy, which I have been on. I've been on that version of Revenge of the Mummy, and I think it's pretty neat. Then in 2005, Peter Jackson remade King Kong again, coming off of the success of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And I think it's worth noting that Universal approached Peter Jackson to remake King Kong before, as early as the 1990s, but it was going to be a completely different movie, and eventually it didn't work. But thanks to Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson eventually got to make his own remake of King Kong, and I think it is one of the best remakes out there. It has some great special effects, great action. The dynamic between Kong and Andero is a lot better this time around than in the original, especially compared to the 1976 movie. But at the same time, this movie's 3 goddamn hours long, where I'm never bored watching it. Even with the extended version, I was never bored. But 3 hours is a long time to watch King Kong, and really, a movie like King Kong does not deserve to be 3 hours long. So unlike the 1933 movie and the 1976 movie, this King Kong never actually got a sequel. It was a standalone movie, and I'm kind of grateful that it is. Then in 2008, two things would happen with both monsters. The first one I'm going to talk about is with King Kong, because the King Kong encounter that I mentioned beforehand was unfortunately destroyed in a backlot fire in June of 2008. And I remember that day vividly. I even remember going to Universal a few days after the fire just to see the destruction. And it made me sad because I really loved that old King Kong encounter. So eventually the ride was replaced by King Kong 363D in 2010, which is based off the Peter Jackson movie, and I like this segment of the studio tour. Not as much as the old King Kong encounter, but it's one of the top segments of the tram tour that I always anticipate whenever I ride it. Also in 2008, Yoshimitsu Banno, the director of Godzilla vs. Hedorah, had plans to make a 40-minute IMAX Godzilla movie which utilized the old school special effects with suitmation and miniatures. But unfortunately, that movie never actually got made. Eventually, it caught the interest of Legendary Pictures, but they wanted to make a feature film. So eventually, they had some negotiations with Toho, and thus in 2014, we got the Gareth Edwards directed Godzilla movie, which Yoshimitsu Banno is an executive producer on. And I love this movie. It is in my top 10 of Godzilla movies, at number 10, but still, I think it's a really great reimagining of Godzilla, and hey, the Americans finally got one right. That same year in 2014 at Comic-Con, Legendary Pictures announced that they got the rights to King Kong and were gonna make a King Kong prequel called Skull Island. I don't know if it was meant to be a prequel to the 1933 movie or the Peter Jackson movie, but whatever the case, we were gonna get a new King Kong movie soon. Then in 2015, when Jordan Vogt-Roberts was brought on to be the director, he made a pitch to change the setting from 1917 to the 1970s, post-Vietnam War. And he made this pitch with the intention of they're going to reject it, but Legendary was on board. So because of that decision, the movie was eventually moved from Universal to Warner Brothers and reworked to coexist within the same universe as Gareth Edwards' Godzilla, meaning that Legendary Pictures was setting up the stage for Godzilla and King Kong to fight each other again. Then in summer of 2016, Universal's Islands of Adventure would open up Skull Island: Reign of Kong, which is basically like Kongfrontation, a longer version of the original tram segment. I don't know if this ride was built with the intention of tying into the original King Kong prequel, or if it was just a coincidence that a new King Kong movie would come out the next year. But whatever the case, I haven't been on this ride myself. I haven't been back to Universal Orlando since 2008. But I have a better chance of going on this than I did Kongfrontation. So the day I go back to that resort, I will go on that ride and be excited for it. Also in 2016, we saw the release of Shin Godzilla, which is the best Godzilla movie since 1964's Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, at least in my opinion. I think it's one of the absolute best movies of the last decade, and to this very day, I wish that movie had gotten nominated for Best Foreign Film at the Oscars. I think it is that good. In 2017, we saw the release of Kong Skull Island, which is a lot of people's favorite Monsterverse movie. Not mine, I still like the Gareth Edwards Godzilla more, but it's very fun, and it's the first King Kong movie to be made that doesn't have to rely on the 1933 movie. Because most of the famous King Kong movies are just remakes of the 1933 movie. And if they weren't remakes, like King Kong vs. Godzilla or King Kong Escapes, then they heavily borrowed stuff from the original movie. Kong Skull Island doesn't do that, and is thus allowed to stand on its own. So it was really great to get an original King Kong movie for once, even if it borrows a lot from Apocalypse Now. And the end credits scene for that movie confirmed that Kong not only coexisted with Godzilla, but also Rodan, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, setting up the stage for the next installment of the Monsterverse, which we're gonna have to wait for because later that year, Toho released the first animated Godzilla movie, Planet of the Monsters, which was also the beginning of the anime trilogy, and it's a terrible beginning. It's a slog of a movie, but the best thing I can say is that it's not as terrible as its two sequels in 2018, City on the Edge of Battle and Planet Eater. Then in 2019, we saw the release of Godzilla King of the Monsters, directed by Michael Dougherty. I like this movie. I will never defend it, and when I like it as a guilty pleasure, but I would really like to look at everybody who put this on their worst of 2019 list and say, you want to kick a Godzilla movie in the nuts? Look at the anime trilogy. Like, that is so much worse than King of the Monsters ever will be. But regardless, that movie didn't perform as well as the last movie. I don't know if it really bombed, but it certainly underperformed and was considered a disappointment. But by the time that movie came out, they were already in production with Godzilla vs. Kong, which is coming out very soon, next week. And that's the entire history of both King Kong and Godzilla, how they fought for the first time and what led up to this epic rematch. Again, I'm excited for this movie. After all the delays, it's exciting to finally see this movie, and so exciting to see these two monsters fight each other again, something that I never anticipated seeing in my lifetime. Will it be a good movie? Well, for my sake, I hope it is, but I honestly wouldn't be surprised if it ends up being bad. I just hope at the very least it's entertaining, and all of the monster fight scenes are filmed in a much better fashion than the fight scenes in King of the Monsters, which based on the trailers, it seems like we don't have to worry about that. So, yeah, next week. I'm excited. And there you go, that's my history lesson on both King Kong and Godzilla. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something from it. And now I want to hear from you guys. What did you think of the video? Was there anything you learned from this? Whatever the case may be, let me know in the comments below. And until next time, this is the real Mr. Robinson telling you there's only one. Hello everyone, I just want to say thank you all for watching my recap or history lesson on both King Kong and Godzilla. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to follow me on social media, whether that be Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Go check out my Twitch channel and support me on Patreon. I'll see you guys in the next video, but until then, have a good day and take care of yourselves.